A puppy left to freeze until a cat found him. The storm rolled in without much warning. In the small mountain town of Windale, nestled between towering pines and thick white-blanketed hills, the locals had grown used to unpredictable weather. But even they hadn't expected the sudden onslaught of icy wind and snow that swept through the valley that afternoon. By dusk, the sky was a bruised shade of gray, and snowflakes the size of feathers floated down with an eerie, determined stillness. Streets emptied. Shop signs creaked in the cold, and the air grew sharper with every passing hour. Inside the warmth of an old woodshed, tucked behind a half-frozen stream and hidden beneath layers of overgrown shrubs, a cat named Juniper lay curled on a pile of straw. She was lean but strong, her fur a patchy mixture of black and orange, thickened slightly by the approaching winter. Her green eyes flickered with wariness and wisdom. Juniper was a stray, but not by misfortune. She had chosen this life, far from the tight walls and loud voices of the shelter she once escaped. Juniper had survived 4 winters in Windale. She had outlived her litter mates and endured frostbitten nights, near starvation, and howling predators. The woodshed had become her sanctuary, a little pocket of safety where she could watch the world go by without being seen. The people of Windale, while not unkind, were preoccupied with their own lives. No one noticed the cat who quietly scavenged outside the bakery or watched from behind the church as children played in the snow. But something was different about this storm. Juniper's ears perked up as a gust of wind rattled the loose wooden slats of the shed. Her instincts stirred. The air smelled heavier than usual, too still, too loaded with silence. Her paws shifted against the straw. Somewhere deep in her chest, a feeling bubbled up. Not quite fear, but something close. She stood up, padded to the entrance of the shed, and stared out into the white blur. Snow danced violently, sweeping in swirls across the ground. Trees groaned under the weight. The world was a sheet of white chaos. Juniper narrowed her eyes. Her kind usually avoided storms. But tonight something called to her. And then she heard it. A sound so soft it was nearly swallowed by the storm. A whimper, short, desperate, and impossibly faint. Juniper's ears twitched. Another whimper, this one more insistent. Her eyes scanned the snow-covered field that stretched beyond the stream. Nothing but wind and snow. But she heard it again. She stepped out into the cold, her body low and nimble. Her paws sank into the icy crust as she crossed the stream and moved toward the sound. The wind stung her eyes. She paused, sniffing, listening. And then she saw it, a lump in the snow. No bigger than a loaf of bread, a bundle of matted brown and white fur barely moving. The shape quivered once, then fell still. Juniper's heart raced. It was a puppy, a tiny trembling creature with wet fur, curled in on itself as if trying to disappear into the snow. Its breaths were shallow, uneven. One eye was swollen shut, the other, cloudy, dull, and barely open. Juniper inched closer, uncertain. She hissed softly to test if the puppy would react. It didn't move. Just another whimper. Weaker this time. Juniper could have turned away. She had done so before. Passed by wounded birds, abandoned squirrels. That was the law of the wild. But this was different. Something about the fragile bundle made her stop. Maybe it was the way its tiny chest lifted and fell. Or maybe it was that she recognized something in its pain, a loneliness she knew too well. The puppy wouldn't survive the night. Not in this storm, not alone. Juniper patted around the little creature, sniffing cautiously. The smell of fear was strong, but underneath that she smelled blood, ice, and a hint of milk. It must have been separated from its mother. No, more likely thrown away. She remembered a night like this once, years ago, when she was small and sick and someone had left her by the side of a road in a shoebox. A storm had saved her then, by leading her to the bakery, where warmth had spilled out through a back door. She had survived. She would help this puppy do the same. Juniper stepped forward, gently nudged the tiny creature with her nose. No response. She did it again, firmer this time. The puppy whimpered, its eyes fluttering. Good, Juniper thought. Still alive. But the wind howled louder now, and snow was already piling around the puppy's tiny frame. Time was running out. Juniper moved behind it, crouched low, and began pushing her body against the puppy's side, urging it to move. It stirred faintly, legs twitching, but too weak to rise. She couldn't carry it, but she could guide it. Juniper patted in front of the puppy, turned back, and meowed loudly. She repeated it, meowing, circling, nudging. The puppy lifted its head, just barely, a wheeze, a pitiful whimper, and then, slowly, painfully, it tried to crawl. Inch by inch, it followed her. The journey back to the woodshed was slow and cruel. The wind pushed against them like an angry tide. Juniper walked ahead, then stopped, turning to nudge the puppy every few steps. The snow clung to its fur, freezing it stiff. Several times it collapsed, too tired to move. But Juniper waited each time. Sometimes she lay down beside it for warmth. Other times she pawed gently at its side until it whimpered again. An hour passed, maybe more. By the time they reached the stream, the puppy could no longer crawl. Juniper stood over it, panicking. The current below was thin but fast, half frozen with jagged ice at the edges. She had crossed it earlier with ease. But now, with the puppy? She paced in circles. Then suddenly, she leaped back across. She darted into the shed, grabbed a torn piece of her old blanket in her mouth, and dragged it back across the snow. She pulled it beside the puppy and began pawing at the snow, creating a shallow cradle. Then she wrapped the blanket around the shivering creature, curled her body against it, and waited. The wind howled. The storm raged. But they were together now. Through the long, frozen night, Juniper didn't sleep. She pressed her body against the puppy, licking its ears, its paws, trying to keep it warm, trying to keep it alive. The puppy whimpered occasionally, sometimes nudged closer. When dawn came, pale and blue, the storm finally faded. The sky cleared enough for soft light to spill across the snow. Juniper stood slowly, stretched, and looked at the puppy. It was breathing deeper now, still weak, still cold, but alive. Juniper nudged it once more, and this time the puppy opened both eyes. They were mismatched, one a soft brown, the other a cloudy blue. A birth defect, maybe even blindness in one eye. But they were eyes that looked at Juniper with something close to trust. She meowed softly, a greeting. The puppy whined. It tried to sit up, fell, then tried again. Juniper waited. She didn't know what came next, but she knew, as she stared into the puppy's tiny face, that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The wind howled like a wounded creature across the desolate snowfields, battering the tiny makeshift hollow where the cat had curled herself protectively around the trembling pup. The blizzard showed no mercy, and the world beyond their fragile shelter had disappeared beneath a furious white veil. Still, she held her ground, fur puffed, tail curled around the puppy's frail form, as if to shield him from the harshness of a world that had already abandoned him once. The night was long, and for hours the cat did not move, not even to groom herself, which she usually did out of instinctive pride. Her golden eyes blinked slowly against the flurries that whipped through the trees. Every now and then, the puppy would twitch or let out a soft, barely audible whimper, and the cat would press her body closer, purring gently, a low, rhythmic hum that resonated more in comfort than warmth. In her own language, in her own feline way, she was whispering, "You are not alone." She had not always been alone herself. Once she had been a house cat. Her name had been Junie, given to her by a kind elderly woman who had taken her in as a kitten. She remembered that house vividly, the sunbeams that streamed through the kitchen window, the way her human used to laugh when Junie chased after falling leaves in the garden, in the soft floral blanket they would nap under together during rainy afternoons. But time, as always, had not been kind. The woman had grown sick, then silent, and one day strangers came to the house and took everything away, including Junie. Only they hadn't really taken her. They had forgotten her. Left behind, she waited at the stoop for days until hunger forced her to move on. The streets became her new home, and over time, she learned how to find food, where to hide, and which humans could be trusted with a slow blink or gentle nudge. Yet despite the pain, the betrayal, and the biting loneliness, Junie had not forgotten what it meant to care. It was why, when she found that pup, a crumpled heap of fur and despair, she didn't walk away.
The pup, meanwhile, lay weak and shivering, his small form barely more than skin and bones. Every breath was labored, and his eyes fluttered between open and closed, as though even staying awake was a struggle. But as dawn crept toward the horizon, the pup's breathing began to steady, faintly rising and falling in time with the cat's soft purrs. His body was no longer as cold. Junie's warmth, though not strong, had slowed the freezing that would have surely claimed him. Morning brought a pale gray light and with it, a temporary lull in the storm. Junie stretched her legs cautiously, stepping out into the clearing while glancing back to make sure the pup was still breathing. Satisfied, she set off through the snow, her paws sinking with every step, tail held low to preserve heat. She had to find help. She didn't know where exactly, but she remembered something, an old shed tucked at the edge of the woods. It had once housed tools and sacks of birdseed, and sometimes a kind man left a bowl of scraps there for the strays. It wasn't far. She had been there before, months ago, but she knew it was the best shot. Every second she was gone, Junie's instinct screamed at her to turn back. The puppy was helpless. What if a fox found him? Or worse, a person who didn't care? But she pressed on, her legs stiff from the cold, her whiskers coated with frost. She reached the shed just before midday. It was still there, dilapidated and sunken from years of neglect, but the door swung open with a light push. She slinked inside and let her eyes adjust. There, in the corner, near a rusting shovel, was an old dog bed. Faded and threadbare, but dry. Junie meowed softly, a call of hope, and returned to the snowy path. The puppy was still there, curled where she had left him. His eyes were open now, cloudy but alert. When Junie approached, he tried to lift his head but couldn't. She nudged his ear gently, reassuring him that he hadn't been abandoned again. Then she began the slow, agonizing task of guiding him toward the shed. She nudged him, gently at first, then firmer. The pup whimpered. His legs barely responded, and he collapsed after just a few steps. But Junie didn't give up. She darted around him, nudging and meowing, licking his face and pawing at the snow around him. The pup, as if recognizing the urgency in her movements, tried again. He rose, staggered, and took a few more steps. It was not a straight journey. Several times, the pup fell and lay still, panting and too weak to move. Each time, Junie sat beside him, waited patiently, and started again when he showed signs of strength. It took hours. By the time they reached the shed, dusk was falling, and the wind had picked up once more. Junie led him inside and pushed him toward the bed. He collapsed into it, his body finally allowing him the rest he desperately needed. She nestled beside him once again, her body curled against his, her chin resting atop his side. She purred. Deep and strong this time. They had made it. In the following days, the shed became their sanctuary. Junie scavenged during the early mornings and twilight hours, slipping into nearby yards to steal bits of food from open bins or scraps from old porches. Her loyalty to the puppy never wavered, she always returned with something, even if it meant going hungry herself. The puppy, whom she had mentally begun to call Snowy, grew stronger. Each day he could move a little more. His tail wagged weakly the first time he saw her return from one of her trips, and Junie nuzzled him proudly. By the end of the week, he could follow her around the shed on wobbly legs. They became a unit, unlikely companions forged in the crucible of winter. Junie would teach him how to find shelter under old leaves or behind bushes. Snowy, in turn, would bark at passing birds and keep Junie warm with his growing body as they slept. It was during one of their scavenging walks that a miracle happened. A young woman named Elsie, walking her golden retriever near the woods, spotted them. She froze, staring in disbelief at the sight of a black cat leading a small, white puppy through the snow like a parent guiding a child. She crouched and extended a hand. Snowy whimpered, unsure. Junie stepped in front of him protectively, her eyes locked on Elsie. But then, the golden retriever approached, friendly and wagging, and something shifted. Snowy took a hesitant step forward. Junie didn't stop him. The woman smiled gently and whispered, "Well, aren't you two something special?" The wind had begun to die down when Elsie knelt in the snow, her breath misting in the cold air as she extended her hand toward the unlikely pair. Snowy, the fragile white puppy, took one hesitant step toward her and then another. He paused and looked back at Junie, as if seeking permission. Junie didn't move. Her golden eyes, calm but alert, watched the woman carefully. And in that moment of stillness, something wordless passed between them. Trust. The golden retriever beside Elsie wagged his tail enthusiastically, his big brown eyes friendly and curious. Snowy, emboldened by the presence of another dog and driven by hunger and instinct, stumbled into Elsie's arms. He was trembling, his thin frame almost weightless. Elsie gasped as she cradled him. "You poor baby," she whispered. She looked at Junie, who now stood just a few feet away, fur dusted with snow, tail tucked but not in fear. The cat wasn't running. She wasn't hissing or crouching. She was waiting. Were you taking care of him?" Elsie asked softly. Junie blinked once. There was something incredible about that moment, something beyond comprehension. A feral cat saving a dying puppy, bringing him back to life, shielding him from the storm. It was the kind of thing Elsie might have read in a children's book. But this was real. She scooped up Snowy in her coat and stood, then turned and reached into her pocket for her phone. "I need to get you two out of the cold," she murmured. She took a step toward her car, but paused. Junie hadn't followed. Elsie turned, her heart catching in her chest. "Come on, sweetheart. You too." But Junie just stared, unmoving. Her paws were still planted in the snow, and her expression was unreadable. For all her heroism, she was still a cat of the wild, wary of the warmth of human hands that had once left her behind. Snowy whined in Elsie's arms, twisting his head to look at his feline protector. He barked once, weak, hoarse. Junie's ears flicked. Her gaze softened. Then, slowly, she moved forward. One paw. Then another. Not running, not afraid, just cautious. She reached the car, where the door stood open, and looked inside. It smelled strange. Like dog and leather and peppermint and a little like safety. Snowy squirmed inside Elsie's coat, whining again. His head poked out, and he looked down at Junie, his tail wagging softly under the fabric. Junie leapt into the back seat. The ride to Elsie's house was quiet. Snowy fell asleep almost instantly, exhausted. Junie curled up next to him, her tail wrapped around his tiny paws. Elsie kept glancing in the rearview mirror, shaking her head in disbelief. She had found them only by chance. Her dog, Baxter, had insisted on taking the trail by the woods that morning. She had almost said no. Almost. By the time they reached the small farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting the snowy world in hues of lavender and rose gold. Elsie pulled into the driveway, parked, and gently carried Snowy into the house. She left the car door open. Junie hesitated but eventually followed, tail twitching, eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. A fire crackled in the hearth. A soft dog bed lay beside it, and bowls of water and food were already waiting, thanks to Baxter's presence. Elsie placed Snowy on a folded towel and unwrapped her coat. Junie sat beside him instantly, grooming his ears as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Okay," Elsie said aloud, still processing everything. "Let's figure this out." She called her vet and made an appointment. She set out more food and water. She tried to find the right words for the story she was about to post on social media, but there weren't any that could capture it fully. Not yet. For now, she simply watched. The next few days were transformative. Snowy, now warm and fed, began to regain strength. His eyes brightened, and his tail wagged more often. He followed Junie everywhere, down the hallway, to the litter box, where he sat confused, and even to the window where she perched to watch birds. He mimicked her, loved her, and adored her as if she were his mother. Junie, for her part, remained a mixture of mystery and warmth. She wasn't quite a house cat again, but she wasn't wild anymore either. She let Elsie pet her, sometimes. She used the litter box. She accepted soft blankets and a corner by the fire. But more than anything, she kept vigil over the pup she had saved. Her watchful eyes missed nothing. It didn't take long for the story to spread. Once Elsie shared the tale, along with photos of Snowy curled up next to Junie, tails touching, eyes closed in peace, the internet did what it does best. It fell in love. Comments flooded in. A real-life fairy tale. This cat has more compassion than most people. I can't stop crying. Please keep sharing updates. Shelters began reaching out. Journalists emailed. One local newspaper ran the headline, "The Cat Who Saved a Life." And through it all, Junie and Snowy simply lived, unaware of their growing fame, content to nap side by side and explore the safety of a new world. One morning, as the snow began to melt and patches of green peeked through the white, Elsie took them both to the vet. Snowy was still underweight but otherwise healthy. Junie, to everyone's amazement, was in excellent condition. She must be incredibly resilient, the vet said. And brave. And loyal. When Elsie explained their story, the vet simply nodded and said, "That cat saved his life." No question. Back home, Elsie knew it was time to make a decision. She could have tried to find Junie's old home, but something told her Junie had already made her choice. She hadn't just rescued Snowy. She had allowed herself to be rescued, too. That night, Elsie placed 2 new tags on a pair of soft collars. One read, "Snowy." The other, "Junie." She held them up. "What do you think?" she asked. Junie sniffed hers and blinked slowly. Snowy licked her hand. That was a yes. Spring arrived gently, and with it, a new rhythm settled into the household. Snowy grew rapidly, no longer the fragile pup who had almost frozen to death in the snow. He was playful, affectionate, and intelligent. He liked to steal Junie's nap spots. She tolerated him, usually with a sigh and a flick of her tail. They became inseparable. When Elsie took Snowy on walks, Junie sometimes followed, darting between trees or lounging under bushes. When Snowy got nervous at night, Junie climbed into his bed and curled up beside him. When Junie found a warm patch of sunlight, Snowy sprawled beside her, tongue lolling in bliss. They had formed a bond that defied explanation. Not just survival. Not just companionship. Love. And in that quiet little farmhouse, surrounded by meadows and birdsong, a cat who had once been abandoned and a puppy who had once been thrown away lived out their days in peace, safety, and the warmth of something truly extraordinary. The world outside was beginning to thaw. Crocuses peeked out from the melting snowbanks, and birds returned with songs that trilled across the meadow behind Elsie's cottage. The frost had lifted from the windows, and with it, a subtle change had come over the household, not loud or sudden, but steady and soul-deep. Inside, life pulsed with new rhythms. Each morning, as dawn crept across the sky in pink and gold, Junie was the first to rise. She'd leap gracefully to the windowsill, amber eyes scanning the awakening world outside. Her tail would twitch in quiet anticipation, ears flicking at the sound of robins and breeze. And not long after, as if bound by an invisible thread, Snowy would stir in his dog bed beside the fireplace. He never needed to see Junie to know she was near. The scent of her, the feel of her movements in the air, the soft sound of her leap, it was all he needed. He'd pad sleepily over, his body bigger now, stronger, tail thumping lightly as he nudged her with his nose. Sometimes she pretended to ignore him. Sometimes she licked the top of his head with a single, regal swipe before jumping down and trotting toward the kitchen. That was their morning ritual, silent, seamless, and born from a bond deeper than instinct. Elsie, now accustomed to their routine, would already have water and food waiting. She often watched from the archway, her heart tugged anew each time she saw them together. It wasn't just that they had survived. It was that they had flourished, and they had done so in a way that filled her home with a warmth she hadn't known she'd been missing. Snowy was no longer the fragile, half-frozen pup she'd scooped from the snow. His coat now gleamed, thick and soft, a bright white like fresh snowfall. He'd grown into his paws and ears, still a little oversized, and his eyes sparkled with intelligence. But despite his size, he remained gentle. Still quiet. Still humble. Still soft around the edges. Junie had changed too. Gone was the feral skittishness. She moved through the house like a queen now, still cautious with strangers, still elegant and mysterious, but her affection for Snowy was a constant. She curled up with him during naps, rubbed against him during play, and even hissed protectively when a neighbor's curious dog wandered too close to the porch. They were a pair that defied every expectation. It wasn't long before Elsie noticed something remarkable. Snowy had started to mirror Junie. He learned to be still when she was still. He watched birds with her, sitting beside her on the porch in perfect silence. He tiptoed around the kitchen like her, walking softer than most dogs ever did. He even began to groom her, awkwardly and messily, which she tolerated with a resigned flick of her tail. But most astonishing of all, he stopped barking. He never barked for food. Never barked when the mail truck rumbled up the lane. Never barked when Elsie left the room. Instead, he communicated the way Junie did, through touch, through gaze, through posture and stillness. Theirs was a language of glances and gestures, of closeness and care. And while it baffled the occasional visitor, it was clear to Elsie that they understood each other perfectly. Once, Elsie caught them sitting by the fire, not touching, just looking at each other. Snowy's head was tilted slightly. Junie's ears were back just a bit, her tail draped like a golden ribbon over her paws. They sat like that for nearly 5 minutes, unmoving. Elsie had taken a photo and later captioned it, "Some conversations don't need words." The post went viral again. With spring fully in bloom, life around the house shifted once more. Elsie began gardening again, planting herbs and flowers along the path leading to the woods. She started leaving the back door open, letting fresh air and sunlight flood the kitchen. Birds nested in the eaves, squirrels darted across the fence, and the meadow buzzed with life. Junie and Snowy spent hours outside each day. Junie taught Snowy the territory, where the best sun patches were, where the field mice burrowed, though neither of them hunted them, and which trees offered the best climbing branches for a nimble cat. Snowy couldn't climb, of course, but he'd wait patiently at the base, tail wagging, tongue lolling, as Junie observed the world from above. In those hours outdoors, they became more than companions. They became explorers. Guardians. Family. Elsie began to wonder how much of what she saw was nature, and how much was something more, something like fate. How else could she explain the cat that saved a puppy's life? The dog that grew up to understand silence like a feline? The way they moved together, one heartbeat in 2 bodies? One rainy afternoon, Elsie invited her niece and 2 nephews to visit. The children were young, curious, loud, and bursting with energy. Snowy, ever the gentle soul, bounded to greet them with his wobbly gait and exuberant kisses. Junie disappeared under the couch. But she watched. When the children finally sat down, Snowy flopped beside them, his body forming a warm cushion. The youngest, a boy named Theo, tried to sneak food into his palm and feed it to Snowy like a treat. Snowy licked it delicately from his fingers. Junie crept out slowly, cautiously. She padded to the corner of the room and sat. Her eyes narrowed, not in aggression, but in deep assessment. And then, as the rain tapped gently on the windows and laughter filled the room, she leapt onto the back of the couch and lay down, not close, but not far. That was Junie's way. Watching. Assessing. Protecting. The children were smitten. That night, as Elsie tucked them into sleeping bags on the living room floor, she overheard the eldest whisper to the others, "That's not just any cat. She's magic." Elsie smiled. Maybe, just maybe, she was. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills in shades of orange and lavender, Elsie sat on the porch with a cup of tea. Junie and Snowy lay curled up together on the wicker couch beside her, their fur mingled in a swirl of white and gold. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming lilac. Crickets had begun their nightly song. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Elsie looked down at the two of them and whispered, "You saved each other, didn't you?" Neither of them moved. She didn't need an answer. Because she already knew. It started with a cough. Just a little one. Snowy had been chasing Junie through the meadow, both of them weaving between the tall spring grass like children playing hide and seek. The sun glinted off Snowy's white fur, now almost golden under the afternoon light, while Junie darted like a shadow between the wildflowers. They paused beneath the shade of an old oak, panting from the thrill of the chase. Snowy dropped into the grass with a dramatic thud, tongue lolling, eyes bright with joy. Junie, poised and graceful, rubbed her head along his side before curling beside him. And then, he coughed. It wasn't loud or alarming at first. A single breath caught strangely in his throat, followed by a half-hearted sneeze. Junie perked up, looking at him. He blinked, nudged her with his nose, and everything seemed fine. But Elsie noticed it again the next morning. This time, it came with a lethargy that unsettled her. Snowy didn't bound out of his bed as usual. He rose slowly, his tail wagging weakly, and walked with a limp that hadn't been there before. His food bowl remained half full by noon, something that had never happened since he came under her roof. Junie hovered near him all day. She didn't eat either. Elsie tried not to panic. After all, puppies caught colds too. The air had shifted lately, warmer during the day, cooler at night. Maybe it was just a chill. But by the third day, Snowy was coughing through the night. His breathing grew labored, and his once clear, gleaming eyes now looked cloudy and dull. Elsie bundled him in a soft blanket, heart pounding as she loaded him into the car. Junie refused to be left behind. She leapt into the passenger seat and settled close, her eyes fixed on Snowy with an intensity that left Elsie feeling more than a little shaken. They drove in silence, save for the rhythmic wheezing from the back seat. The vet clinic was a quiet one, tucked at the edge of town near the lake, surrounded by pines. Dr. Marta, an older woman with kind eyes and steady hands, examined Snowy with care. She asked questions gently, her voice soft, but Elsie heard the worry behind every word. "We'll need X-rays," she said after a few minutes. "His lungs don't sound right. Could be pneumonia. Or something deeper." Elsie nodded, unable to trust her voice. Junie sat on the exam table beside Snowy the entire time. She didn't flinch at the machinery, didn't move when Dr. Marta gently adjusted Snowy's position. She simply stayed, her paw resting on Snowy's side, her body curled protectively. "She's quite the guardian," the vet murmured. "You don't see that kind of bond every day." Elsie could only nod again. That evening, the results came. It wasn't pneumonia. It was a congenital defect. Snowy's lungs, even from birth, had been fragile. The stress of the snowstorm, the exposure, the trauma, it had taken its toll. Dr. Marta explained that while Snowy had recovered beautifully, there had always been a ticking clock. His lungs were prone to infection, and now they were inflamed, battling something his body could barely withstand. "He's a fighter," she said, "but this will be hard. He'll need antibiotics, maybe oxygen therapy. A lot of rest." "Is he going to make it?" Elsie asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Marta didn't answer right away. "We'll do everything we can." At home, the house fell into silence. The once lively rooms, filled with soft thuds and playful tumbles, now echoed with the hum of a heating pad and the occasional clink of a water bowl. Snowy lay curled in his bed by the fire, his breath shallow, his body too still. He refused food. Only water. Barely. Junie didn't leave his side. Not even for a moment. She refused to eat, refused to nap anywhere else. She even began dragging her toys, her crinkled mouse, her knotted yarn ball, toward him, placing them gently by his paws as if to say, "Remember? This is who you are." Elsie watched, helpless. She coaxed Snowy with broth, with treats, with warm rice and chicken. Some days he would take a few bites. Most days, he didn't. She called Dr. Marta every 2 days with updates. They adjusted medication. Changed routines. Prayed silently. And still, Junie remained by his side. One night, as the wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the windows, Elsie sat beside the fire with a cup of tea in trembling hands. Snowy was lying still, his sides rising and falling with effort. Junie was curled tightly against him, eyes closed but not sleeping. Elsie whispered into the room, to no one and to both of them. "You can't give up now. You didn't come this far for this." As if on cue, Junie opened her eyes. And then, in a move that startled even Elsie, she stood up, walked over to Snowy's bowl, and began to eat. It was only a few bites. But it was enough. Snowy turned his head slowly. And then, for the first time in 2 days, he tried to stand. Recovery wasn't sudden. It came in increments. A paw stretch here. A soft bark there. A nibble of food at dawn. A tail wag by dusk. But each small victory felt monumental. Elsie began to document them again, photos, notes, videos. Day 4, Snowy barked at the bird feeder today. Junie looked surprised, then smug. Day 6, he climbed halfway up the porch steps. I cried. Junie's watch never ended. As Snowy grew stronger, she stayed close. When he napped, she napped. When he walked, she walked. It was as if she had tied her heartbeat to his, and only when he surged did she let herself breathe. By the 3rd week, Snowy was running again. Not long distances. Not for long. But enough. Enough to prove that some bonds don't just heal, they resurrect. Spring bled into summer. The meadow exploded in color, lavender, daisies, buttercups swaying in the breeze. Snowy chased butterflies again. Junie stalked grasshoppers. Elsie sat on the porch with a journal, capturing every moment. They had passed through the fire and come out the other side. Stronger. Closer. Unbreakable. The town whispered about the cat and dog who had survived a storm, nursed each other to life, and taught an old woman how to believe in magic again. Because that's what it was. Not just love. Not just loyalty. It was faith, carried on silent paws and in the wag of a once broken tail. The garden gate had always marked the boundary of their world. Inside was the sanctuary, the warmth of Elsie's home, the flicker of the fireplace, the scent of blooming jasmine and fresh-baked bread. Outside lay the unknown. Trees whose names they didn't know. Roads that stretched into forever. Shadows that held secrets. Junie, ever cautious, had respected the gate. Snowy, during his early days of healing, hadn't had the strength to test it. But now, the world beyond whispered again. And Snowy, fully recovered and brimming with newfound strength, began to listen. It began subtly. He'd sit by the gate at dusk, watching the world outside as if remembering something. His ears perked with every rustle, and his nose twitched at every new scent. Junie would sit beside him, gaze flicking between him and the winding path beyond the fence, her tail curling protectively around her paws. Elsie noticed. One afternoon, as she watered the marigolds along the garden's edge, she paused to observe them, Snowy standing tall, head high, and Junie, alert but hesitant. "You're curious, aren't you?" she murmured. "You've got the wind in your bones now." Snowy turned his head at her voice and gave a low, contented bark. Junie blinked slowly, a gesture Elsie had come to know as quiet understanding. That evening, she left the gate ajar. The first time they stepped beyond it, it was tentative. Snowy led, paws touching the dirt path with reverence. Junie followed, her body close to his, her gaze sweeping the surroundings like a sentinel. They didn't go far, just to the bend where the meadow ended and the woods began. But it was enough. The next day, they went further. Past the birch trees. Along the old creek. Their adventure opened like a storybook, page by page. Snowy discovered new scents, foxes, squirrels, the musky scent of deer. He sniffed at wild mushrooms and scratched excitedly at patches of moss. Junie, more composed, leapt onto fallen logs and watched birds with narrowed eyes, occasionally swatting at leaves that dared fall too close. They began returning later each day. Elsie didn't worry. She watched their confidence grow. For Snowy, it was a rebirth of wildness, of instincts dulled by injury now awakened. For Junie, it was love made tangible in the form of watchfulness. She never let Snowy wander too far. She always returned with him. One morning, Elsie packed a small bag with water, fruit, and a warm blanket. She opened the gate wide and said, "Go on then. Find your story." They found an old cabin deep in the woods. Dilapidated and moss-covered, it stood near a quiet pond, the air around it thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Snowy was the first to dart inside. Junie hesitated, then followed, her steps soft, cautious. Inside was dust, cobwebs, and the faint remnants of memory, an old rocking chair, a broken lantern, a rusted kettle. But there was also peace. It was quiet, untouched, sacred. They made it theirs. Over the next few days, it became their secret place. They'd trek through the woods in the morning and nap in the sun-dappled corners of the cabin. Snowy would rest his head on Junie's flank, her purring a soft melody in the silence. Sometimes, Elsie would join them. She'd sit on the porch, notebook in hand, chronicling their adventures. Day 52, Snowy found a turtle. Junie hissed at it. The turtle was unfazed. Day 58, they napped for 2 hours straight, side by side, under a shaft of golden light. I cried. The three of them, old woman, dog, and cat, had created something rare and unspoken. A family forged not by blood, but by survival, by trust, by the magic of second chances. But the world beyond the fence, like all things wild, had its own challenges. One day, Snowy didn't return by nightfall. Elsie waited on the porch long after the stars appeared. Junie came back alone, ears low, tail drooped. She paced by the garden gate, meowing anxiously, then sprinted back into the woods. Elsie's heart clenched. She grabbed her coat and flashlight and followed Junie's lead. The forest at night was different. The shadows were deeper. The silence was heavier. Junie darted ahead, pausing every few yards to look back and make sure Elsie was close. They reached the cabin, but Snowy wasn't there. Junie sniffed the air, then bolted down a path Elsie hadn't seen before. Her flashlight beam danced across tree trunks and brambles, catching flashes of white fur until finally, there he was. Snowy was stuck in a thicket, his paw tangled in a snare. It wasn't a hunting trap, just an old wire loop likely left by a careless camper. But it had cut into his leg, and he was whimpering softly. Elsie fell to her knees. "Oh, baby," she whispered, tears welling. "I've got you." She freed his paw gently. Junie licked his ears, her body vibrating with stress. The walk back was slow. Elsie carried Snowy most of the way. Junie didn't leave their side. Snowy recovered again, but this time, things changed. He was older now. Slower. He didn't race through the woods the same way. He sat more. Watched more. Rested longer. Junie adjusted too. She no longer chased shadows or climbed trees. She stayed beside him, her body always a breath away from his. And yet, their bond deepened. They still visited the cabin. Still curled together beneath the broken windows. But now, they seemed more present, more content to simply exist in the moment. There was no rush. No need to conquer the forest. They had what they needed. Each other. One evening, as the sky painted itself in lavender and gold, Elsie sat on the porch with a cup of tea. Snowy lay beside her, head in her lap. Junie was curled on the windowsill, her tail flicking lazily. Elsie whispered into the fading light, "You two have lived lifetimes together in 1 year." Snowy thumped his tail. Junie opened one eye and blinked slowly. And so, life settled into rhythm again. They'd gone beyond the fence. They'd found their adventure, their danger, their quiet sanctuary. And now, they returned home, not because they had to, but because they chose to. They had seen the world beyond. And they knew where they belonged. Together. Always. Spring arrived like a quiet sigh in Weller's Hollow. The thick snow that had once buried every path began to shrink away, uncovering earth, stone, and the muted greens of returning life. With it came the next chapter for Juniper and Whistle, a chapter not marked by survival, but by healing and growing, together. Roger's little cottage, once silent except for the creak of pine wood and the crackling of fire, now echoed with soft purrs and eager tail wags. Whistle had grown stronger, not just in body but in spirit. Though still blind, he had memorized every inch of his new home. He no longer flinched at unexpected sounds. He no longer whimpered in the night. His trust in Juniper was complete, and in her quiet company, he had learned how to be a puppy again. Juniper, always graceful and wise, took on her unexpected role as guardian and mentor with feline poise. She would gently nudge Whistle's shoulder when it was time to eat. She guided him to the patch of sun on the rug when warmth poured through the windows. And in the evenings, as the world outside turned indigo and the fire hummed softly, she curled against him, their bodies curled like quotation marks at the end of a long, peaceful sentence. The townsfolk who once feared the blizzard now spoke of its miracle. Roger's story, of the stray cat who found a dying pup in the snow and saved them both, spread beyond Weller's Hollow. Children came by to visit. Neighbors brought treats. A local teacher even began using their story in her classroom to teach compassion. But for Juniper and Whistle, the world was small and perfect, the garden filled with clover, the humming of bees, the smell of warm bread from the kitchen, and the shared joy of simply existing side by side. One day, as Roger sat sipping tea on the porch, he watched them play in the yard. Whistle stumbled through tall grass, trying to chase a butterfly he couldn't see. Juniper was ahead of him, leaping gracefully, making chirping noises to keep him close. Roger smiled. This was a new kind of harmony. One built from broken beginnings and shaped into something whole. They were more than pets. More than companions. They were a pair whose connection was forged in snow and storm and solidified in seasons of peace. And unknown to them both, time was moving. Old age crept in silently, the way moss grows, soft, slow, inevitable. Juniper's bounding became softer. Whistle's muzzle grayed around the edges. But the bond remained untouched. Deeper than ever. As summer gave way to another winter, the story of their bond was no longer just a local tale. It was a legend. Years later, the small town of Weller's Hollow had changed in many ways. Shops had new signs, the school had been painted twice, and the winding main road had been paved. But at the heart of it all, a familiar sight remained, a small stone in Roger's garden, nestled beneath the sycamore tree, inscribed with just a few words. Juniper and Whistle, love that saw no difference. Juniper had passed first. One crisp autumn morning, she hadn't risen from her patch of sunlight on the window ledge. Her breath had stopped in the middle of a purr. She left peacefully, her face resting against the cool glass, watching the world she had saved come back to life in golden hues. Whistle was quiet for days. He moved slower. Ate less. And though blind, he found his way to the tree every morning and lay beside her grave, his body pressed to the earth as if still listening for her heartbeat. Roger buried her wrapped in a soft wool blanket, placing her favorite toy, an old feather wand, beside her. He carved the stone himself with shaky hands, tears streaking down weathered cheeks. Whistle lasted another winter. By the time spring returned, he too had grown tired. One night, Roger found him lying in the garden, facing the sycamore, his breathing shallow but calm. When the sun rose the next morning, Whistle did not. They were buried side by side, under a tree that bloomed every spring with small white blossoms. Roger kept the garden just the same. He told their story to every child who visited, every guest who asked. And as the years passed, the legend of the cat who saved a blind puppy in the snow became a tale every family in Weller's Hollow passed down. Tourists would sometimes stop at the gate, asking quietly, "Is this where Juniper found Whistle?" And Roger, with a warm smile, would nod. One winter evening, after Roger himself had long passed, a young girl and her father stood in that garden. The snow was falling gently, covering the stone, the bench, the sycamore tree. The girl clutched a small drawing in her mittened hands, two animals curled together in the snow. She set it by the grave. "Do you think they're together again?" she whispered. Her father nodded. "I think they never left each other." And far in the woods, where the wind whispered and the pine swayed, some say two figures still roam side by side, a graceful calico and a sturdy blind dog, forever together in the silence of the snow.